I never thought the sound of forks clinking against porcelain could feel like knives against my skin, but that night it did. My children sat at the long mahogany table, their little eyes darting toward steaming plates passed from hand to hand, plates that never seemed to reach them. My youngest, Charlotte, just 8 years old, leaned into me and whispered, "Mom, aren't they going to give us food?" My throat tightened as I watched my relatives, my own blood, eat heartily, laughing and sipping wine, pretending not to notice my kids' empty plates. That's when I realized something horrific. They had chosen this moment, this family dinner, to starve us. And not by accident. No, this was deliberate. I clenched my fists under the table, rage simmering inside me. That was the night I swore. They would regret ever making my children feel invisible. My name is Evelyn Hargrove, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived most of my life in Asheville, North Carolina, a quiet town where church bells echo on Sundays, and everyone seems to know each other's secrets. I raised 2 children of my own, and now, in my so-called golden years, I've been raising 2 grandchildren after tragedy struck their parents. My son, Mark, and his wife, Lydia, were killed in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving me as the only shield between my grandkids and the cruel world. I thought family would support me. I thought they'd embrace my grandchildren as their own. But that night, when the food skipped their plates, when the smirks and sidelong glances told me this was intentional, I knew the people sitting across from me weren't family anymore. They were enemies hiding behind polite laughter. I had never felt shame like that before, watching my babies go hungry while fried chicken and mashed potatoes made their way around the table. I could see grease glistening on lips, hear the crunch of cornbread breaking between teeth, smell the sweet tang of baked apples wafting across the table, and yet nothing touched my children's plates. My cousin Miriam leaned over and said with fake sweetness, "Oh, I thought you'd already eaten before you came. We wouldn't want to waste food, you know." That word sliced through me. My grandkids weren't waste. They weren't leftovers. They were children, hungry, deserving, and loved. I bit down so hard on my tongue that I tasted blood, but I forced myself to stay quiet, watching, waiting, burning with a resolve I hadn't felt in decades. Charlotte's older brother, Caleb, only 11, tried to be brave. He sat up straighter, pretending he wasn't hungry, but I saw the way his stomach growled, how his hands fidgeted under the table. "It's okay, Grandma," he whispered to me, his voice trembling. "We can eat when we get home." Tears pricked at my eyes. He was trying to protect me, trying to protect his sister, and it broke me inside. What kind of people make children beg silently for food? What kind of relatives strip away dignity like that, bite by bite, in front of everyone? That was the moment the rage transformed into something sharper, something colder. Revenge wasn't just an idea, it became a promise. As the dinner dragged on, I kept my face still, though inside my mind was a storm. Every word, every laugh, every smug glance burned into me like a brand. I memorized it all. Miriam's smirk, Uncle Paul's chuckle, the way my Aunt Ruth looked at Charlotte with dismissive eyes. It wasn't just about food, it was about power. They wanted to show me that I was beneath them, that my grandchildren didn't belong, that we were outsiders in our own bloodline. But what they didn't know was that I had endured storms far greater than their cruelty. I had survived widowhood at 39, bankruptcy at 45, and burying my own son before I turned 60. These people thought they could break me with an empty plate. Well, they had awakened something far more dangerous inside me. When dessert came out, pecan pie, chocolate cake, and warm peach cobbler, I watched Charlotte's lips part, her little body leaning forward instinctively. But again the plates never reached her. Miriam smirked and slid the last piece of pie toward her own daughter, a girl who already had crumbs smeared across her cheek. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to overturn the table, to grab every dish and shove it into my children's hands. But I stayed still. Because sometimes silence is not weakness, it's strategy. I knew if I exploded then they'd win. They'd say Evelyn lost control. Evelyn's ungrateful, Evelyn's bitter. No, I would not give them that satisfaction. Play their game for now. But the rules would soon change. I excused us from the table early, my children's heads low as we walked past towering platters of leftovers. In the car, Charlotte broke down, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Grandma," she sobbed, "why don't they like us? Did we do something wrong?" My hands trembled on the steering wheel. No child should ever have to ask that question. I pulled over, turning to face them. "Listen to me," I said, my voice shaking with both love and fury. "You did nothing wrong. They are the ones who should be ashamed. And I promise you, one day they will be." My grandchildren's wide eyes locked on mine, a flicker of hope shining through their hunger. In that moment, my vow hardened into steel. When we got home, I made them peanut butter sandwiches with what little we had left in the pantry, and I watched them devour every bite as though it were a feast. As they ate, I sat silently at the table, rage coiling through me. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every cruel detail of that dinner. But instead of breaking me, it built me. I started to plan. They thought starving my children was a victory, but they had just handed me the weapon I needed. Every insult, every slight, every laugh would soon become their undoing. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Blue Ridge Mountains, I stood at my kitchen sink, sipping bitter coffee and staring out the window. My reflection in the glass looked older, more tired than I remembered, but my eyes were alive with fire. I whispered to myself, "They think they won last night. They have no idea." And in that whisper was a promise of war, not with fists or screaming matches, but with something far more powerful, the truth. I knew things about my family, secrets they had buried deep, lies they prayed would stay hidden. And now, for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt about digging them up. If they wanted to starve my children, I'd starve them of their reputations, their comfort, their pride. This is only the beginning of my story, and trust me, what comes next will leave you breathless. If you've been here with me through this first chapter, I want you to stay with me until the end. Make sure you hit subscribe, because you won't want to miss what happens when a grandmother who has lost everything finally decides to fight back. And as for my family, they had no idea what was coming. The night after that cruel dinner, I sat in my worn recliner staring at an old photo album. My son, Mark, smiled back at me in those faded pictures, holding baby Caleb in his arms, Lydia cradling newborn Charlotte beside him. Their eyes were bright, full of hope for the future they'd never lived to see. Tears burned down my cheeks. I whispered into the silence, "I wish you could see them now, Mark. They're strong, but they're hurting. And your family, our family, treated them like dirt." Grief blended with fury inside me, twisting into something darker. That dinner hadn't been just about hunger. It was about erasing my grandchildren, making them feel like outsiders in their own bloodline. And I realized, looking at those photographs, that if I didn't fight back, they'd succeed. I couldn't allow my children's legacy to be stomped into the ground like crumbs on a floor. The next morning, I woke early and busied myself with small chores. I swept the porch, watered the garden, even polished the old oak table in the kitchen. But every movement was mechanical, my mind circling back to that night. My neighbors waved as they walked their dogs down the street, and I forced a smile, hiding the storm inside me. Nobody would guess that just 24 hours earlier, I had sat at a table where my grandchildren were treated like pests, where food had been weaponized against us. The world outside kept moving, but my heart was stuck on replay. It wasn't just the hunger. It was the humiliation, the laughter, the way Miriam smirked as if she had triumphed. I thought of Caleb whispering, "We can eat at home," and something inside me cracked. How could an 11-year-old already understand shame like that? By noon, I couldn't bear the silence of my house anymore. I drove to the grocery store, bought pancake mix, syrup, eggs, and bacon. When I got home, I cooked enough for an army. The kids came into the kitchen, eyes wide, and asked, "Grandma, what's the occasion?" I forced a cheerful smile, though inside I was breaking. "No occasion," I said. "We deserve a feast." We sat at the table, syrup dripping, bacon sizzling, and I watched my grandchildren eat with joy. But even as laughter filled my small kitchen, my mind drifted back to the cold stares and empty plates at Miriam's table. My grandchildren should have been able to laugh there too. I realized then that revenge wasn't just about me. It was about giving my grandkids the dignity they had been denied. They needed to see me stand up, to know that cruelty doesn't win. That night, after the kids went to bed, I opened an old wooden box buried in the back of my closet. Inside were letters, photographs, and dusty documents I hadn't touched in years. Family secrets. Skeletons that had been locked away. I flipped through them slowly, memories flooding back. My Uncle Paul's bankruptcy papers, which he'd begged us never to tell anyone about. Aunt Ruth's affair with a church deacon, hidden behind Sunday smiles. Miriam herself with her perfect marriage, though I knew about the restraining order her husband had once filed, something she would rather die than admit publicly. As I held those pieces of paper in my hands, my lips curled into a grim smile. They thought they could shame me. They thought they could make my grandchildren feel worthless. They had no idea I was sitting on enough ammunition to blow their reputations apart. Still, part of me hesitated. I'd been raised to believe family was sacred, that no matter what, blood should protect blood. My late husband, Henry, always told me, "Don't air dirty laundry." But as I sat on the edge of my bed, those papers spread around me, I thought of Charlotte asking through tears, "Why don't they like us?" And Caleb whispering about eating at home. Those words echoed louder than Henry's old advice. Maybe there was a time for silence, but this wasn't it. This was war. And in war, you don't win by staying quiet. You win by striking where it hurts most. I folded the papers neatly, slid them into a folder, and tucked it under my arm. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anticipation. For the first time since that dinner, I felt powerful again. The following Sunday I went to church. The same church where Ruth held her head high, where Miriam paraded her perfect family, where Uncle Paul slipped extra money into the offering plate to look generous. As I sat in the pew, my folder beside me, I studied their faces. They smiled, shook hands, sang hymns as if their souls were spotless. And all the while, I sat there holding their secrets like dynamite. I could ruin them with a single spark. During the service, Pastor Harris spoke about forgiveness, but his words barely reached me. My mind was elsewhere, calculating, planning. Revenge wasn't about screaming at them or flipping a table. It was about precision, about timing. And I knew that when the moment came, it would be at one of these gatherings, where their masks were on full display. That's when I'd tear the masks away. But revenge takes patience, and patience was something I'd learned the hard way. Raising kids on my own, burying my husband, surviving financial ruin. Patience was survival. That night, I sat with my grandkids in the living room, watching them play Monopoly. Charlotte's laughter rang out as she bankrupted her brother with fake money, and for a moment, the heaviness lifted. Yet beneath the surface, my mind ticked like a clock. They deserved better. They deserved to know their grandmother wouldn't just stand by while others tried to erase them. I promised myself that every move I made from here on out would be deliberate. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about building a future where Caleb and Charlotte would never again question their worth. And to do that, I had to make sure our family understood one thing. You don't starve children and walk away unscathed. As weeks passed, invitations still came. Birthdays, anniversaries, family cookouts. I accepted each one with a polite smile, never letting on what brewed inside me. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them thinking they'd won, that their cruel dinner had put me in my place. Meanwhile, I gathered more. I listened carefully when they spoke, remembered every boast, every slip of the tongue. Miriam bragging about her daughter's grades, though I knew the girl had been suspended twice. Paul boasting about his business, though bankruptcy still loomed. Ruth singing in the choir while sneaking glances at a man who wasn't her husband. My folder grew heavier with each secret I tucked away. My children had been starved for one meal, but I was feeding myself on truth, and one day soon, I'd serve it back to them hotter than any casserole they ever withheld. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when Caleb asked me, "Grandma, are we going back to Aunt Miriam's again?" His voice was nervous, cautious. I hesitated before answering, my heart aching. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "But don't worry. Next time will be different." He tilted his head, confusion in his young eyes. "How?" I smiled, though it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was sharp, dangerous. "Because they won't see what's coming." Caleb nodded, still uncertain, but I could see he trusted me. That trust was fuel. I couldn't let him down. That night, as I tucked the children into bed, I whispered to myself, "Soon." And in the quiet of my room, I began to sketch out the first real step of my plan. Because if they thought one dinner was the end of my story, they hadn't yet seen what a grandmother with nothing left to lose could do. I watched my daughter climb the porch steps with her braided hair swinging, and for a second I felt the ordinary ache of being a mother. The pride and the worry braided together like those small ropes in her hair. When Miriam opened the screen door, I saw how her smile tightened at my presence, like the snap of a trap that wants to seem friendly. The children were already clustered at the picnic table. They churned peanut butter sandwiches into heroic shapes, unaware of the cold ledger at my side. I had not come to argue at the family table. I had come to expose a pattern, to show everyone the way my children had been starved by silence and omission. Memories of grocery shelves half full and tuition notices left unheeded rose to the surface, bright and bitter. I remembered nights of my little one's knuckles white and asking for one more peanut butter sandwich, and how I folded those requests into myself until they dimmed into shame. Henry had told me to let it go once, said family dust settles and you sweep it away. I had swept, and the dust had kept returning like the smell of smoke after a small kitchen fire. Today I was done sweeping. At the head of the table, Paul laughed and told a joke that landed with the exact right sound. People laughed because they knew how to. I set the folder on my lap and smoothed the cover with a deliberate motion. My hand felt the edges of paper and the weight of names. I thought of the night I found the grocery receipts stuffed under a false bottom in Miriam's pantry, the way I had held them in the dark like a small, battered map. Those receipts had led me to a pattern. Dates when food stopped coming, months the children had been given cereal instead of milk, excuses offered and stitched up. Those receipts had been a compass pointing me toward a truth I couldn't unsee. My voice when I spoke came out quieter than I expected, because I wanted the words to cut clean and slow, not splinter uselessly. I opened the folder just enough to let the first page show and let my eyes find a face I could not unremember from the nights when bowls sat empty. Paul's laugh died when he noticed me. "Everything okay?" he asked, and his question came heavy with the assumption that my presence was part of the scenery, a harmless domestic punctuation to their weekend. Miriam folded her hands and said my name in that syrupy, small polite tone reserved for relatives who do not know how to hold conflict. I took a breath and let the children move closer, small faces curious because they always are, and then I read a single note aloud, one line from a list transferred to me by the grocery clerk across town. It named a week and an amount, and it named a pantry purchased and then ignored. The words were simple enough, but they hit like an accusation. Somebody shifted, a plate scraped. My son Marcus, who always pretended he did not hear fights, looked down at his hands and did not speak. That silence tasted like consent. I saw the ledger's truth reflected in a dozen eyes. There had been months where nourishment had been negotiated, reduced to a calculation in the margins, and that calculus had been kept from parents and from children. Flashbacks came sharp as hail. Dinners with bread and nothing else, the way my eldest's belly went quiet before sleep, the whispered plea at night. "Is tonight the night we don't have peanut butter?" That lodged in me like a splinter. I remembered going into Miriam's kitchen late and seeing cereal boxes stacked in the corner, as if they were an afterthought to a home that had grown clever in its vanishing acts. I remembered asking simple questions and watching faces make themselves blind with polite answers. It's a strange thing to realize that someone you loved could choose a lie as their daily labor. Love had been rearranged in that house to favor image and margin over hunger. I could feel the slow burn of my decision then. The resolve to not be the mother who forgave in silence, to instead stand up like someone finally remembering to claim her voice. The children leaned in and I saw their trust lie bare and raw. They believed in us, and someone had been breaking that trust systematically. Miriam's tone when she replied was small and practiced. Blame the stress, blame the tight months, offer a calendar of promises. She spoke so fast sometimes, as if volume and speed could stamp out the cold details. I knew the urges she used were old and sure, the urge to soften, the urge to lean on family to rewrite the ledger. But the receipts did not soften. The list did not rewrite. Each line named a day when my children were left pantry short on purpose or saved for someone else's pride. When Miriam said, "We did what we could," I felt something cold move inside me, like the click of a latch that lets a door close forever. What you could included choices that put social peeling before scraped plates. I found myself more furious than ashamed. I thought of the nights I sat up late with an aching chest, wondering whether I had misread the world. This was no misreading. It was deliberate. As the argument swelled into the edges of the yard, guests watched with that voyeuristic hunger for drama that makes ordinary cruelty into spectacle. Parents raised eyebrows, old friends tilted heads, and the children circled like small survivors who still trusted adults to be their harbor. I could have marched away and kept my indignation private, but there is a point where privacy enables harm to continue. I unfolded a second page and showed the roster of doctor's calls and missed recovery appointments. Appointments for my youngest's ear infections, for heat rash that a parent's touch should have soothed, appointments ignored because one person deemed them unnecessary expenses. The town clinic had records. I had them printed. "You left them sick," I said, and the words felt like a verdict. I watched Miriam's face. For a moment it registered surprise and then, like a slide forced in place, the mask of offended motherhood. "You're making this about blame," she said. "Why do you want to punish us?" I realized she had confused accountability with vengeance. Punishment wasn't my aim. Repair was. But repair begins with truth. My son Marcus stood up then, and his voice broke like glass. He recited a simple, aching memory of a cold winter when the heater had been off and the children had huddled in blankets while adults laughed in another room. He said the word forgotten, and it lodged like a stone. No one had called it forgetting. It was a decision. The crowd shifted. Acquaintances had to reconcile the woman they waved to at school, pick up with a ledger of choices now visible. Miriam's brother muttered into his beer about how families fight, how every house had its cracks. But nobody else had charts of missed medical care or receipts of months where cereal was the main dish. My heart felt both heavy and buoyed. Heavy for what had been stolen from my children, buoyed because finally the water was being seen for what it had carried. I looked at the children and felt a protective fierceness unfurl in me. They could not be left with this stain as truth. We would rewrite the story. The meeting ended with neighbors shifting alliances the way dry leaves shift in wind. Some made small, awkward apologies that meant nothing. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to place themselves in the moral distance I had occupied for months. Miriam hugged a child and whispered carefully, as if apology could be performed. I stayed at the table and wrote a short note to the social worker I had called earlier, arranging for a visit and for food assistance to come quickly. This was not about punishment for punishment's sake. It was about immediate safety and long-term correction. I felt the eyes of some people judging me for taking outside help. Some thought family matters should be handled without anyone else knowing. But secrecy had fed the problem. The truth, once seen, makes it harder for cruelty to hide. I made a small, fierce promise to myself that day. I would be louder, steadier, and more relentless than whatever force had normalized my children's hunger. That night, as I tucked the children into beds that smelled of play and outdoor sun, one of them turned to me in the half-dark and said, "Will you make sure we don't go hungry again?" The question was both heartbreaking and galvanizing. I held a small hand and I whispered that I would do everything possible. Revenge, if it came, would not be about spectacle. It would be about building shields. I thought about how I would go about it. Legal steps if necessary, counseling, food assistance, and a careful watch. Miriam's choices had severed trust, but trust could be rebuilt with constancy, not with one-off speeches. The night felt full of both grief and a fierce, patient hope. I slept only a little, planning the next day like a battle mapped in kindness and clear action. Morning came with a sun that made the grass look like a field of small coins. I prepared to canvass neighbors I trusted and to call the appropriate agencies with documentation in hand. There would be resistance, no doubt. Family loyalty is a strong thing that can be weaponized to protect selfishness. But the children deserved a different world. I checked the folder, feeling the crinkled paper like an old talisman, and I stepped out of the house into a day that would require steadiness. I had spoken. The next steps demanded ritual and repetition. Small acts of care repeated until they became safety. I thought of all the mothers who did not have the voice, and I felt both sorrow and a responsibility to act for more than my own family. This was no longer simply my fight. It was a turning, a broader claim that hidden cruelty will be called to account. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed that night, staring at the wall clock ticking loudly as if it wanted to remind me of every wasted second of my life. My mind replayed the image of my children sitting there with empty plates, their small hands folded in their laps, too afraid to ask for food. My chest burned with both anger and shame. I was their mother, yet I had let someone else treat them as less than human. That night I made a promise to myself. I would never let it happen again. But promises have a way of testing you before they keep you. The very next morning I dropped the kids off at school and drove straight to my sister's house. Lydia had always been the only one who understood me. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon rolls, her smile warm as always, and her arms wrapped around me before I even said a word. She didn't need me to explain. She could see the pain written all over my face. I finally broke down, telling her what happened at the family dinner. Her face hardened with disbelief and then anger. They starved your babies. At their own family's table. Oh, Eloan, you can't let this slide. I wanted to tell her I already knew that, but the words stuck in my throat. Lydia was a fighter, always had been, while I was the one who kept trying to keep peace. Growing up, she defended me from bullies while I just stayed quiet. But this time, her fire felt contagious. She leaned across the table, her hands gripping mine. Listen to me, you don't have to fight alone. I'll stand with you. But first you need to make a decision. Do you want to forgive them, or do you want to make them regret ever crossing you? That question would haunt me for weeks. The problem wasn't just about forgiving or fighting. It was about dignity. How could I forgive people who looked my children in the eyes and decided they weren't worthy of food? How could I go back into their house, sit at their table, and pretend everything was fine? I had spent years trying to blend in with my husband's family, always baking extra pies for holidays, always volunteering to clean up after everyone, always smiling when they barely acknowledged me. And for what? To watch them break my children's hearts right in front of me. I went home that evening and watched the kids play in the backyard. Callum was trying to climb the small tree near the fence, his skinny arms shaking with effort. Nora was on the swing, her laughter ringing out in the crisp autumn air. They were happy, in that innocent way children can be happy even when life is unfair. But I couldn't ignore how thin they looked, how small their frames were compared to other kids their age. That family dinner wasn't just about humiliation, it was about survival. My children needed me to be stronger than I had ever been before. When Thomas came home, I told him everything. At first, he didn't even look at me, just sat down on the couch and rubbed his temples. Eloan, they didn't mean it like that, he finally said. My family has their quirks. You're taking it too personally. I felt something inside me snap. Too personally. Watching your kids get starved wasn't personal. I stood in front of him, my hands trembling, my voice rising in a way it rarely ever did. They looked at our children, Thomas. They let them sit there with empty plates while everyone else ate like kings. If you can't see how cruel that is, then maybe you don't see us at all. He tried to calm me down, but his words were like cold water, not fire. You're overreacting. Let's just move on. But how do you move on from betrayal? I realized then that Thomas would never fight for us. He was too tied to his family, too afraid to rock the boat, even when that boat was sinking with us inside it. And if he wouldn't fight, then I had no choice but to fight for all three of us. That was the night the seed of revenge started to grow inside me, quiet but unstoppable. Lydia called me again later that week, asking if I had made a decision. I told her everything about my argument with Thomas, how alone I felt in my own house. She sighed, but then her voice turned firm. Then it's just you and me now. And trust me, Eloan, they won't see it coming. If they want to play cruel games, then we'll show them what cruelty really feels like. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, not fear but anticipation. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of silence being lifted off my shoulders. But before I could plan anything, I needed to gather strength. I began journaling late at night, writing every hurtful thing that family had done to me since the day I married Thomas. The comments about my clothes, the whispers about my accent, the way they laughed when I tried to join conversations. It was all there, pouring out of me like poison finally leaving my veins. And as I wrote, I began to see patterns. They didn't just starve my children out of spite. It was part of a long, deliberate pattern of showing us that we would never belong. That realization gave me clarity, and clarity gave me power. One night, as I tucked Nora into bed, she looked up at me with her big hazel eyes and whispered, "Mommy, why didn't they give us food? Did we do something bad?" My throat closed up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I kissed her forehead and held her close, promising her she did nothing wrong. But inside I knew what had to happen. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the story my children would grow up remembering. They would never look back and think their mother was too weak to stand up for them. They would remember that their mother fought with everything she had. And soon, the family who starved them would learn that lesson the hard way. I started small, like a surgeon testing the blade on paper, mapping wounds before I cut. Lydia sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, eyes steady and fierce. We talked logistics, not drama. Who we could trust, what documentation we needed, and how to protect the children. She suggested community resources, legal clinics, and a woman from the church who ran a food pantry anonymously. We made lists on a scrap of paper, dates, receipts, contacts, turning memory into evidence. I felt a tremor of power as the chaos in my chest ordered itself into plan. There was no glamour in revenge. It was paperwork, calls, quiet meetings at noon in parking lots. But each small act was a stitch, sewing safety where there had been holes. By the time we finished, there was a folder with tabs and a schedule that could not be ignored. I drove home feeling like a person who had finally remembered her name. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. The first practical step was to secure immediate aid for the children so no one could weaponize hunger again. I called the local food bank and explained, carefully without naming names at first, that 2 kids needed help. They arranged a delivery and a meeting with a social worker who specialized in family neglect cases. I met her that week. Carla, sharp, efficient, with a soft voice that understood how to ask the right questions. She listened to receipts and records and did not frown or moralize. She catalogued and nodded and planned. We arranged for regular food deliveries, clinic checkups, and school lunch support. When the first delivery arrived, I watched Callum tear open a bag of apples with a joy so raw it hurt. It was a small victory, but victories build like bricks when the house has been on fire. Knowing they would not go hungry that week let me move to the larger work of holding people accountable. Hungry children have less power in a world already set against them. Feeding them restored a little balance. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. Next, I began the work of collecting proof that would stand up to skeptical eyes. I spent afternoons at the town clerk's office, requesting copies of records, and nights on the phone with clinics. Old receipts, school notices, the town's health records. Each piece had a shape when laid out on the table. Sometimes the evidence was banal, a repeated pattern of missed appointments or unpaid co-pays. Other times it felt like finding fingerprints at a closed-door crime scene. Notes in margins, dates crossed out, excuses penciled in. I copied, filed, and scanned until the folder looked like a thick medical chart. Folding the papers, I no longer felt like a woman pleading in shadow. I felt like someone preparing interrogation. There is power in paper. Names and numbers anchor accusations against memory's slippery nature. I labeled everything clearly, page numbers and dates, because if I was going to take them on, I could not be vague. Accuracy would be my armor, and I sharpened it until it glittered. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. As the evidence mounted, I also built a circle of quiet allies, neighbors who had seen more than they admitted. Mrs. Green from next door remembered nights when the kids played outside in closing hours without warm coats. Victor, the grocery clerk, handed me a ledger of purchases, his hands trembling as he slid it across the counter. He whispered that Miriam had often returned goods, claiming they were for someone else, yet receipts told a different tale. Each person who came forward did so softly, like a confession, and I treated every testimony with respect. We met in basements, church halls, and once in a library stairwell. Secrecy protected those who feared family backlash. One by one, their small courage filled the room like oxygen. When people see injustice and speak, the world tilts. It won't right itself, but the tilt makes repair possible. With each witness, my folder transformed from accusation into a case. And the more we learned, the less anyone could lie with confidence. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. I considered the legal path, what it would require and what it could break, and I did not like the sight of what we might lose. Courtrooms were places that demanded bluntness and evidence, and were hungry for spectacle that could scar children further. We had to be surgical, use the law to protect, not to punish in a way that would terrify the kids. Carla recommended a family advocate who guided us through safe reporting and protective orders for neglect. We filled forms that felt both bureaucratic and brave, statements that read like a chronology of small violences. Filing the petition felt like raising a flag. It signaled something public and immovable had begun. I wanted them to feel consequence without turning our lives into endless testimony against relatives who still sat at holiday tables. That balance required care and counsel, and I learned to ask for both without shame. When the advocate told me the courts take food neglect seriously, I allowed myself a small, wary hope. Hope, after hunger, tastes like metal and old coffee, but it is nourishment nonetheless. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. Meanwhile, Miriam and her clan remained oblivious to the machinery warming up beneath their polite smiles. They continued to post pictures of family gatherings, pie and wine, the veneer of abundance polished for public eyes. I watched their social media the way a detective watches a suspect, noting times, attendees, and the easy proximity to food. Sometimes it felt like shouting in a crowded room. Other times like carving initials into a tree. Slow, private. I did not want to humiliate them publicly without cause, but I wanted to make sure the world saw what I had seen. So I began a quieter campaign of reputation, calling a few trusted family friends, arranging small conversations where the truth could seep out gently. The goal was not to wreck their lives overnight but to make indifference costly. When someone profits from the illusion of care, the currency must be taken away. I let questions be asked in people's kitchens and parking lots. Curiosity is a small avalanche. By the time the whisper reached the right ears, the foundation of their reputation had begun to shake. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. One afternoon, Lydia and I drove to the county fair where the family was set to appear at a pie contest, Miriam's signature event. I felt like a spy dressed as a grandmother, blending into the crowd while my stomach knotted with anxiety. We mingled, smiling at neighbors, all the while timing a quiet move. The fair had a modest press table for human interest stories. I arranged, through a friend, for an interview about food insecurity in small towns, carefully steering the conversation toward the realities I knew. When the reporter asked about hidden hunger, I told the truth without names, painting the pattern rather than the faces. But patterns invite questions, and when the reporter left with a gentle, pointed curiosity, she noted the juxtaposition. A table of abundant pies while certain children in town went hungry. A small paragraph ran online the next day, and the ripple of it touched people who mattered. Teachers, nurses, a councilwoman. It was not sensational. It was a seed. Yet seeds change fields when they find good soil. Miriam's triumphant pie photos now had a shadow in the margins, a question hovering over their shine. The first crack in the porcelain had appeared. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. The social worker was the one who taught me patience in public pressure. Carla explained that agencies moved slowly by design, that evidence must be undeniable and the child's welfare paramount. She set up mystery visits, routine checks where a caseworker would stop by unannounced to observe living conditions. We prepared the children for visitors with simple honesty. Some grown-ups want to help keep you safe, I told them. They nodded, trusting, unaware of how heavy the days had been. The mystery visits found a house that smelled of home, but also patterns of neglect documented with the receipts and the clinic notes we had collected. When the worker produced a gentle referral for parenting classes and food assistance insisted upon, it landed like authority at the right time. Miriam bristled when she received the letter, calling it an overreach. She told others it was gossip weaponized. But the system had seen the numbers and the dates, and numbers are stubborn companions to truth. The machinery of care had been engaged, and it began to move in its multivalent, imperfect way. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. As the public pressure grew quietly, family dynamics shifted in subtle but telling ways. Paul started missing gatherings. His laugh thinned when he arrived. Miriam's daughter stopped posting carefree pictures with her, instead sharing distant vistas. At the grocery store, neighbors who once smiled politely now averted their eyes or offered stiff, apologetic nods. It was a small revenge, perhaps, but revenge need not be theatrical to be effective. It simply must be persistent. I watched this unfold with an odd mix of sorrow and satisfaction, because the point was not humiliation for its own sake but accountability. I still sat with the kids at bedtime, reading stories and tucking blankets tight, making sure the practical work of care never faltered. Revenge without nurture is cruelty in another costume, and I refused to become what I despised. Instead, I fed the children, kissed their foreheads, and let them see a woman who would not let injustice pass without consequence. Their trust, fragile and bright, became the compass that kept me from losing my moral center in the hunger for retribution. We moved forward with both tenderness and strategy in equal measure. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. The chapter closed not with a courtroom drama but with an invitation I extended to Miriam, a family mediation at the community center. It was a deliberate choice, public enough to hold her accountable, private enough to avoid spectacle. In the envelope I placed a polite letter, copies of the documentation summarized, and an offer to work together for the children's well-being rather than to destroy one another. I knew she would not accept without protest. Pride ran thick in their veins. But when the envelope arrived on her kitchen table, a knot had already formed in their public image, and people were watching her reaction. Sometimes, the threat of repair is more terrifying than the demand for punishment because it forces a reckoning with truth. I wanted her to choose. Admit and rebuild, or resist and watch the slow dismantling of the comfortable life she had curated. Either way, change was incoming, and with it the power of consequences. I folded the last paper into the folder and sat back, feeling exhaustion and a ferocious clarity. Tomorrow would be the first day of the rest of our lives, but I could not predict if it would be peaceful or cataclysmic. I thought about it long into the night, plotting the next move with care and relentless attention to detail. Miriam did not come to the mediation. Instead, she sent a message through her daughter, dripping with defiance, that she had nothing to answer for and would not sit at a table with liars. I received the note without shock, but it hardened something in me. Lydia sat across from me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is what we expected," she said, sliding the folder back toward me. "Now we move to the next step." That next step was escalation. No more polite warnings or gentle nudges. We had offered her the chance to admit wrongs privately, but she had chosen arrogance. So we chose exposure. That night, I gathered my notes and planned a meeting with the school principal and the town's community health board. If Miriam wanted to stand in denial, then let her stand under the weight of evidence. She would not be able to pretend forever. The meeting at the school was more emotional than I expected. The principal, Mrs. Tate, listened as I laid out records and accounts, her face shifting from disbelief to grim recognition. She admitted that teachers had noticed the children seemed distracted and tired, but had assumed it was stress at home. "We suspected something," she confessed, "but we didn't have proof." I slid the receipts across the desk, each one marked and dated. Mrs. Tate pressed her hands together, nodding slowly. "This is serious," she said, her voice low. She promised to call a staff meeting and involve the school counselor immediately. As I left, I could feel the walls beginning to close in around Miriam. The school would not sit idle while children went hungry under their care. They would call, they would check, and they would document. The machinery of accountability was rolling faster now. Miriam might resist, but the cracks in her armor were widening. When the Community Health Board received my report, things shifted further. Carla had already paved the way, filing her professional notes into their system. I simply reinforced the pattern: missed meals, hungry children, false appearances of plenty. The board took it seriously, scheduling home visits and interviews. I knew Miriam would despise the intrusion. Pride was her foundation, and strangers stepping into her kitchen would feel like war. That was precisely the point. She had chosen to ignore the invitation to make amends, so now the town itself would look at her. These visits weren't designed to humiliate. They were designed to protect children, to prove care or expose neglect. Still, humiliation was unavoidable. She could no longer pretend to neighbors and family that everything was fine. The truth was coming through official doors, clipboards and pens in hand. I walked home that day with a strange calmness. The fight was no longer mine alone. Systems were awake. At the same time, whispers in the community grew louder. Mrs. Green told me she had overheard Miriam at the store, her voice sharp, blaming me for poisoning people against her. I almost laughed at the irony. She had poisoned herself with her own choices. I had only brought light into the shadows. Neighbors began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with her angry outbursts and half-truths. Victor at the grocery store confided that she had slammed her basket onto the counter when denied credit. The walls of respect she had enjoyed for years were crumbling, brick by brick, not because of cruelty but because truth corrodes lies. Every time she shouted denial, people remembered the evidence. Every time she deflected blame, they remembered the children's faces. She thought she was fighting me, but in reality, she was fighting the weight of a community's shifting perception. And that is a battle no one wins. The children, meanwhile, began to notice the difference. Food deliveries were steady now, school lunches reliable, and checkups regular. Callum told me one night that his stomach didn't hurt anymore when he went to bed. Grace started to smile at breakfast, playing with her spoon as if eating were no longer a burden. These were the quiet victories I cherished. It reminded me why the war mattered. Not for pride, not for revenge alone, but for small, tender lives that deserved joy. Yet I couldn't shield them entirely from the storm. Miriam's anger spilled into their ears too, with accusations that they were ungrateful or spoiled by my influence. I saw the confusion in their eyes, torn between love and survival. I hugged them tighter, whispering promises that they would never go hungry again. Promises matter when you're small. They are anchors. And I would hold that anchor until my last breath. But revenge, once begun, takes on a rhythm of its own. I found myself both driven and unsettled by how far it had gone. Lydia noticed it too. "You have to pace yourself," she warned. "Don't let their cruelty consume you." I nodded, but inside I felt the fire spreading. It wasn't about destruction anymore. It was about justice. Still, justice has a sharp edge, and I walked carefully, afraid of cutting myself in the process. To steady myself, I leaned into the routines with the children. Homework, meals, small adventures to the park. Each laugh reminded me that this was the point. Each bedtime story steadied my heart. Yet every time I saw Miriam in town, her cold stare tried to pull me back into rage. She was unraveling, and I was both witness and catalyst. And there was no turning back. The breaking point came when the school counselor reported to me, discreetly, that the children had spoken of being punished for eating too much food at home. Grace had told her in a whisper that her grandmother had once taken her plate away, saying she didn't deserve seconds. That broke me. Anger boiled up in a way that words can hardly capture. It wasn't just neglect. It was cruelty disguised as discipline. I went home and pulled the folder from the drawer, laying every page out on the kitchen table. It was time for the final escalation. I called the advocate, the board, the social worker, and I said what I had been holding back. I want this on record. I want consequences. I want this stopped once and for all. My voice shook, but not from fear. It shook from the sheer weight of carrying this truth too long. Enough was enough. When the authorities stepped in formally, the shift was seismic. Home visits became investigations. Quiet warnings became written orders. Miriam raged, of course, slamming doors and making calls, trying to paint herself as the victim of a vendetta. But paper doesn't lie, and children's words carry weight when spoken in the safe presence of a counselor. The system had caught her now, and no amount of charm or denial could erase the evidence. Watching it unfold, I felt both relief and sorrow. Revenge had been necessary, but it had also been brutal. There was no joy in seeing a family member cornered, but there was deep satisfaction in knowing the children were safer. The cost was high, but the cost of silence would have been higher. Sometimes justice is not about winning. It is about preventing further harm. And I had done that. In town the divide grew. Some defended Miriam, clinging to the image they had always known. Others turned away, ashamed they hadn't spoken sooner. For me it no longer mattered. I wasn't chasing approval. I was ensuring protection. One evening as I tucked Grace into bed, she looked up and whispered, "You didn't let them forget us." That sentence was worth every sleepless night, every confrontation, every tear. It was the essence of what I had fought for. Children deserve to be remembered, to be seen, to be fed. And I had made sure of it. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. Systems move slowly, and people cling to denial. But the path forward was clearer now. Miriam's power was cracked, her control unraveling. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe deeply. The storm had not ended, but it was breaking. The chapter closed with a letter on my table, a summons to appear for a formal review with Child Protective Services. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the official reckoning. I sat there, holding the letter, feeling both exhausted and vindicated. Lydia squeezed my hand, her eyes fierce with encouragement. "This is it," she said. "This is where truth stands taller than pride." I nodded, my heart steady. I thought of the children's laughter, the neighbors' whispered courage, the folder stacked with evidence. The time for whispers was over. The time for testimony had come. I folded the letter, placed it in the folder, and looked out the window at the night sky. Tomorrow would be a battle, but it was one I was ready to fight. For the children. For justice. For the promise I had made. The war was entering its final stage. I woke up the morning after my confrontation with Marlene and her family, my chest heavy but my mind strangely clear. For years I had been timid, letting others walk over me, convincing myself it was for the sake of peace. But something inside me had shifted that night. I had finally spoken up for my children, and it felt like I'd cracked open a door I could never close again. As I made breakfast, the smell of bacon and pancakes filled the kitchen, and my children's laughter returned to the house like sunlight after a long storm. Yet, even as joy surrounded me, a small voice whispered, this wasn't over. Marlene wouldn't just let things go. And if I wanted true peace, I'd need to be stronger than ever before. The weeks that followed proved me right. At first, things were quiet, almost unnervingly so. I thought maybe Marlene had finally realized the damage she had done, that maybe she'd retreat into her own world and leave me alone. But Marlene wasn't the type to back down, especially after I embarrassed her in front of her own family. Soon whispers began. Neighbors would greet me with uneasy smiles, as if they knew something I didn't. My children came home from school saying people were asking why their mom didn't know how to behave at family dinners. The rumors were spreading, all carefully planted, and I knew the source. Marlene was poisoning the well, trying to make me look like the villain. It was one thing to humiliate me. Could take that. But when her whispers began reaching my children, staining their lives with gossip they didn't deserve, my anger reignited like wildfire. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a notepad. My hands trembled, but not with fear. This was something different. It was resolve. I started writing down everything I had endured from Marlene and her brood. The lies, the manipulation, the insults, and now the public humiliation. I realized that revenge wasn't about exploding in anger. It was about patience, strategy, and making sure every move cut deep enough to leave scars they'd never forget. And for the first time I didn't feel powerless. Felt in control. But control didn't mean peace. Inside I wrestled with guilt. I asked myself, was I becoming like her? Was I teaching my children to hate, to strike back instead of rise above? Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd sit in the dark and wonder what the line was between justice and cruelty. Yet every time doubt clouded my heart, I thought of my children's hungry faces at that dinner table. I remembered the way they looked at me with confusion and pain as their plates were left bare while everyone else ate. That image burned in me like a brand. No mother who loved her children could forget that. And no woman with dignity could let it go unpunished. One afternoon as I drove through town, I passed Marlene's favorite boutique, the one where she spent hours gossiping with the owner and flashing her wealth. An idea began to form in my mind. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my lips as I thought about her precious reputation. Marlene's pride wasn't just in her house or her family. It was in how the community saw her. She thrived on admiration and appearances. If I wanted to wound her, that was where I needed to strike. Not through fists or screaming, but by unraveling the carefully stitched image she presented to the world. And the best part, I wouldn't need to lie. The truth was sharp enough to cut her down. My first step was subtle. I started volunteering more at local events, showing up with my kids, offering food, laughter, and kindness. People noticed. Slowly, the gossip Marlene had spread didn't match the reality they saw. Neighbors began asking me for advice, complimenting my cooking, leaning into my warmth. I built my own circle of allies without saying a single word against her. It was the opposite of Marlene's poison. It was light in a place she had filled with shadows. But while the community began to see me differently, I knew Marlene was watching. And nothing enraged her more than losing control of the narrative she had crafted. Sure enough, one evening as I left the community center, Marlene was waiting outside by her car. Her smile was brittle, her eyes cold as stone. "Enjoying your little popularity contest?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. I didn't answer. I simply smiled back and walked past her, my silence louder than any insult I could have thrown. That silence broke something in her. I could feel it. She wasn't used to me standing tall, refusing to be baited. And that's when I realized. This was more than revenge. This was war. And I was winning it one quiet, deliberate step at a time. At home, my children noticed the change in me. "Mom, you're different," my daughter said one night as we folded laundry together. "You smile more. You don't look scared anymore." Her words pierced my heart. I hadn't realized how deeply my fear had seeped into them, how much they had absorbed my silence as weakness. Seeing them bloom alongside my own strength was more rewarding than anything. For once, I wasn't just protecting them, I was teaching them to rise. To never let anyone starve them of dignity, love, or respect. And in that moment, I knew my revenge wasn't only about Marlene. It was about rewriting the story of who we were as a family. But just as I was finding strength, Marlene decided to strike harder. At the next family gathering, she tried to corner me with twisted questions, subtle jabs meant to provoke me in front of everyone. Yet this time I didn't flinch. I answered with calm confidence, my words sharp but elegant, each one a mirror reflecting her cruelty back at her. The table grew silent as I dismantled her facade piece by piece, not through shouting but through truth. And in their silence, I saw something I'd never seen before. Shame flickering in Marlene's eyes. For the first time, she realized her power over me was gone. Completely gone. But the war wasn't over. And deep inside, I knew the final strike was still to come. The night after the family gathering, I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, staring at the moonlit sky. For years, I had been afraid of Marlene's presence, her cutting words, her manipulative control. But now, sitting there in the quiet, I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that once choked me had evaporated, replaced by a steady strength I hadn't felt in decades. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing truth that Marlene wouldn't stop until she found a way to destroy me completely. My silence at the table had wounded her, but women like her didn't lick their wounds quietly. They lashed out. And though I had won one battle, the war loomed closer, darker, and far more personal. I braced myself, knowing the storm was far from over. Sure enough, it wasn't long before her next move arrived. A letter came in the mail, one filled with accusations about me as a mother. She claimed I was unstable, unfit, and worse. She tried to question whether I should even have custody of my own children. My hands trembled as I read her venom spilled across the page. I could almost hear her voice in the words, smug and calculating, aiming for my weakest spot. Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. No, I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I tucked the letter into a drawer, closed it, and told myself, she had just made the worst mistake of her life. If she wanted war, then war she would get, but on my terms. I began by gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Text messages, voicemails, witnesses, anyone who had seen how she treated me and my children. I didn't plan to go to court just yet, but knowledge was power, and I was determined to strip her of the lies she hid behind. At the same time, I started documenting my own life, making sure there was no angle she could twist against me. My house was clean, my children cared for. Their schools praised me for involvement. Piece by piece, I built a fortress around us, not just physically but emotionally and socially. And the more I did, the more her rumors began to crumble, because truth always leaves footprints while lies eventually wash away in the rain. But still she pushed harder. She tried to corner my children at gatherings, offering them treats laced with barbed words. She would ask sly questions like, "Does your mommy feed you enough?" Or, "Isn't it lonely at home with just her?" My children, bless their hearts, began to grow weary of her games. One day my son came home and looked me straight in the eye. "Mom," he said, his little voice filled with more wisdom than his years, "we don't want to see her anymore. She makes us feel small." My heart broke at his words, but it also fueled me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about them. And I swore right then and there, I'd make sure Marlene never had the chance to hurt them again. So I decided to flip her game entirely. While she thrived on secrets and whispers, I chose transparency. I began inviting people into my home, neighbors, church members, teachers, and they saw with their own eyes the love and warmth inside these walls. My children laughed, played, and thrived here. The more people saw, the less they believed Marlene's lies. Slowly, the whispers around town began to shift. People who once hesitated around me now defended me openly, questioning Marlene instead. And nothing infuriates a manipulator more than losing control of the story. I could see it in her eyes each time she caught me smiling in public. My revenge wasn't just working, it was cutting her where it hurt most, her pride. But prideful people don't fall quietly. One evening I got a phone call that made my blood run cold. It was the school principal. Marlene had reported me to child services, claiming I was neglecting my children. For a moment, fear clamped its claws back into me. But this time, I wasn't the same weak woman she once knew. When the caseworker arrived, my home was spotless, my children happy, their bellies full and their hearts open. The caseworker left with nothing but compliments. Marlene's cruel attempt had backfired spectacularly, and for the first time, others began to see her desperation. The cracks in her mask widened, and the image she clung to so tightly started to unravel. Yet still I knew she wasn't done. Not until I delivered the final blow. One night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at my desk and stared at the notepad where I had documented every detail of her cruelty. My hand hovered over the pages as I considered my next move. Revenge wasn't about screaming or even fighting anymore. It was about precision, about timing, and about making sure that when she fell, she never had the chance to rise again. My plan was ready. The trap was set. And all I had to do now was wait for the right moment to spring it. My heart pounded with anticipation, fear, and a flicker of satisfaction. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about survival. The day came faster than I expected. A family reunion was announced, one that Marlene herself had organized, desperate to reclaim her throne as the matriarch. I could see her plan already, to humiliate me, to isolate me, to remind everyone of her dominance. But what she didn't know was that I was ready. I walked into that gathering not as the timid woman she once toyed with, but as someone forged in fire. My children at my side, my head held high, I could feel the shift in the air. People looked at me differently now. Stronger, sharper. And I knew in that very moment that Marlene's reign was about to collapse. The final strike was coming, and this time she wouldn't recover. As the evening stretched on, the moment arrived. Marlene raised her glass and began a speech dripping with false sweetness. Her words laced with barbs aimed directly at me. She smiled, expecting laughter, expecting others to turn on me. But this time they didn't. Instead, silence filled the room. Eyes turned not toward her, but toward me. Waiting. Expecting. My pulse raced as I stood, ready to speak. The truth was about to be laid bare, every hidden cruelty exposed, every lie shattered. And in that silence, just before I opened my mouth, I realized something chilling. This was no longer about me fighting for my dignity. This was about ending Marlene's grip over all of us. And once I began, there would be no turning back. I stood up slowly, my knees humming with the strain of so many sleepless nights, and felt the room shift like a tide. Marlene's smile was a fragile thing, the practiced grin of a woman who believes performance can hide rot. I cleared my throat and let the quiet stretch, tasting the silence like iron. Then I began, not with rage but with the steady cadence of someone who has practiced truth until it is honed. I spoke of small things first. The missed dinners, the empty plates, the way children's laughter had once been swallowed by a dining room of polite chatter. I described how I had watched through a hallway window as my kids pushed food away and smiled at lies told around them. I read short notes from teachers and the receipts that wouldn't lie. My voice did not break. It landed. People listened, and the listening changed the shape of the room. When I finished that first telling, there was a pause so full it felt like a held breath, and then questions came like rain. Mrs. Langley, who had once praised Marlene's pies, asked softly about the kids' school lunches. A cousin I barely knew admitted that he had seen children arriving at school hungry, and assumed it was a passing phase. The room unspooled into confessions. Corners that had sheltered gossip now opened to daylight. I passed around a neatly bound copy of the folder Lydia and I had assembled, and hands shifted as people read receipts, messages, and the counselor's notes. It was not spectacle. It was the quiet mathematics of evidence meeting conscience. As neighbors and relatives read, faces fell, and the mantle of silence cracked in visible lines. The truth, like winter light, revealed everything it touched. Marlene rose, voice quivering, accusations folding into each other like paper in a storm. "You're twisting this," she cried, but rawness in her voice undercut the performance. She tried to redirect blame, to paint me as the instigator, a common play from someone used to scripting reality to her advantage. But it fell flat. People who had called me quiet were now saying my name with respect. Lydia stood behind me like a pillar, and in that instant I felt less like a woman with a grievance and more like someone who had pulled back a curtain to show a hazard no one could ignore. Eyes that had once averted now met mine with apology, with regret, with anger at their own complacency. Marlene's practiced fury made her small in a way I had not thought possible. Her script had been learned over decades. The room no longer followed it. After the reunion, the fallout came quickly. People who had dined with Marlene for years began to speak in cautious tones about what they had seen and what they had overlooked. Teachers called to express regrets and to ask how they could help. Neighbors left casseroles with notes of apology, and a local pastor offered to host a community meeting about caring for children. Marlene retreated to a posture of wounded dignity, but her defensive stories no longer had purchase. At the same time, practical steps were taken. The school tightened meal checks, a community pantry arranged discreet deliveries, and the counselor organized play sessions so my children could speak in safety. Lydia and I moved from reaction into planning, converting the energy of outrage into support. As people rallied, I felt a new kind of power, the gentle, persistent force of a community waking up. Marlene's reaction was twofold: public retreat and private ferocity. She posted on social media about betrayal and slander, gathering supporters who preferred the comfort of scandal to the labor of truth. But behind closed doors she escalated in more dangerous ways. Phone calls designed to frighten my neighbors, late-night visits by a cousin who tried to intimidate Lydia, and whispered threats meant to make us doubt our choices. For a while I felt the cold of isolation again, as if the community were a thin sheet about to tear. Yet I refused to be shoved into fear. I documented everything with care, cataloging calls, screenshots, the times men came by asking pointed questions. We informed the attorney and the police of the harassment and asked for restraining measures when necessary. Marlene would learn that cruelty in the dark can be turned into evidence in the light. As winter tightened its grip, practical care turned into long office hours with advocates and attorneys. The legal world is a place of slow machinery and precise terminology, and it terrified me with its formality. Lydia sat with me through consultations, and we learned to translate jargon into action. Custody protections, guardianship options, and restrictions on contact. It was not a theater of revenge but a framework of safety. We filed for a temporary protective order when threats escalated, and the judge, calm, linen-faced, said words that sounded like a bomb. "This court's first concern is the safety of the children." The paperwork was dry and small, but it built a wall between my family and Marlene's rage. While the law did not erase the past, it created boundaries that mattered. For the first time in months, I slept without listening for the creak of the porch light. Court day arrived under a brittle, pale sky. The courthouse smelled of lemon cleaner and worn wood. I dressed with intention, simple, uncluttered clothes that announced seriousness. Lydia and the children sat behind me, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. Marlene sat across the room, flanked by a thin row of allies who looked more like props than people. When my name was called, I stood and felt the gravity of every choice fold into my spine. Speaking in that room, with a judge watching and a transcript being made, I felt both exposed and armored. I told the story plainly, the way I had at the reunion, but with sworn statements and dates attached. Evidence, once a folder in my drawer, now stood as testimony that could not be dismissed by charm. The ruling did not end Marlene's campaign, but it diminished it. She retreated into a quieter kind of fury, posting fewer photos and appearing at fewer events, and spending more time alone. The town, meanwhile, began to rebuild its sense of collective responsibility. Parents who had once turned a blind eye now checked in on neighbors. Teachers updated protocols for spotting hunger and neglect. The pastors' meeting transformed into a working group that published resources and a hotline. For me, the victory felt complicated, cleansing and costly at once. There was relief, certainly, but also the hollow place where old trust had been. I kept reminding myself why I had started, to protect small lives, to teach my children that dignity was not negotiable. Months passed and life learned new rhythms. The kids returned to a more ordinary kind of joy. Soccer on Saturdays, pancakes on slow mornings, and laughter that announced itself without caution. We rediscovered the small rituals that stitch a family back together. Movie nights under a blanket, reading chapters aloud each evening, and the gentle chaos of homework strewn across the table. I watched them reclaim childhood with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes, and sometimes I would catch their hands in mine and feel a fierce gratitude steadying my heart. People who had once pretended not to see now offered help without airs. The scar remained, but it became part of our story rather than the story itself. We were rebuilding not only a home but a sense of worth that would be stubborn and lasting. As the chapter wound toward its close, I understood that revenge had brought consequences both expected and unexpected. I had wanted them to remember, to make Marlene taste the cost of withholding basic care, but I had also come to see that healing required more than punishment. It required building anew. I still had meetings with counselors, careful conversations about holidays, and the occasional awkward encounter when family tables were set, but those moments were softer now. The final reckoning with Marlene would come, perhaps in small legal echoes or in the way the town chose to remember. For tonight, I shut the folder in my drawer, kissed my children's foreheads, and whispered a promise I knew I could keep. We would be all right. The long road had not ended, but the horizon felt brighter, and I walked forward with steady steps. The spring air tasted like possibility, sharp and green, as I opened the windows of our little home and let it pour inside. The children chased one another through the yard, their laughter scattering like petals on the wind. It was a sound I had once feared would be silenced forever, crushed under the weight of Marlene's cruelty. But here it was, unbroken, rising higher than the trees. I stood at the sink, hands still wet with dishwater, and thought about the strange journey from silence to strength. For so long I had kept my head down, whispering truths only in private. Now, even the walls of our house seemed to lean forward, listening, proud of the voice I had found. That voice, though it had been sharpened by pain, was no longer about vengeance alone. It was about the promise that my children would never face the same betrayal again. Marlene's shadow still lingered, though more like a whisper than a storm. She had retreated into her small circle, spinning stories of injustice, but the town no longer believed her theater. People had seen too much, felt too much, to return to blind acceptance. At church gatherings she kept to herself, eyes darting, lips pressed tight. Her allies had dwindled. Even her closest friend avoided her gaze. When I passed her on Main Street, there was no longer fire in her glare, only the exhaustion of someone whose script had been torn apart. Yet I felt no triumph in her decline. The revenge I once thought would taste sweet now carried the weight of ash. It wasn't about watching her fall. It was about what had risen in her absence. My children's laughter, our family's resilience, the slow but steady pulse of a community learning to be accountable. That was the victory worth keeping. One afternoon, I gathered the children at the kitchen table and showed them the folder, now worn at the edges, heavy with documents, photographs, and printed emails. They were old enough to understand, if not fully then at least in part. I told them how this folder had been my shield, my proof when words alone would not suffice. Their eyes widened as they saw the records of meals denied, the counselor's notes, the signed affidavits. My youngest asked, "Didn't it hurt to see all this, Mama?" I paused before answering. "Yes," I said, "but truth always hurts before it heals. And it heals when we use it to protect, not to destroy." I closed the folder and put it back in its drawer. The children leaned into me, and I felt their trust not as a fragile gift but as a sturdy bond that would hold, no matter who tried to weaken it in the future. That was the moment I knew we had truly won. The seasons shifted, and with them came renewal. Lydia and I planted a small garden in the backyard. Tomatoes, beans, marigolds. The kids watered them daily, watching green shoots break through dark soil. It was a ritual of patience, of faith in slow growth. Each sprout reminded me of how our family had emerged from buried places, reaching toward the sun even after months of shadows. Neighbors stopped by to admire the garden, often leaving behind baskets of fruit or baked bread. One neighbor, who had once sided with Marlene, came quietly with a pie and a simple apology. I accepted it with a nod, not because the hurt was forgotten but because holding on too tightly would only poison the soil of what we were trying to grow. Forgiveness, I was learning, was less about erasing the past and more about choosing not to carry it forever. Despite the peace settling over us, echoes of fear sometimes returned. On quiet nights, when the house was still and the clock ticked too loudly, I would think about what might have been had I stayed silent. I imagined my children shrinking into themselves, thinking hunger was normal, thinking cruelty was love. Those images haunted me, but they also fueled my resolve never to let silence rule again. I began speaking at small community meetings, sharing our story not as gossip but as testimony. Parents leaned in with wide eyes, and I saw them carry my words home, changing small habits, asking sharper questions at school. My story became more than my own. It became a ripple in a wider pond. That ripple mattered. It reminded me that sometimes revenge is not about tearing someone else down, but about building walls strong enough to keep harm from spreading further. Marlene tried one final strike. She filed a complaint accusing me of slander, insisting that I had ruined her reputation with lies. The notice arrived folded and stamped, its language sharp with accusation. For a moment, I felt the old panic return, that hollow dread of being pulled back into her world. But this time I was not alone. Our attorney laughed softly as he read the claim, pointing out its lack of merit. "This will not stand," he assured me. And it didn't. Within weeks, the court dismissed it outright. When the ruling arrived, I felt no joy, only a deep exhale, as though I had finally been released from a binding rope. Marlene had swung her last weapon, and it had broken in her hand. I realized then that the war she had tried to wage was over, and I was still standing, my children beside me, stronger than before. The children grew in ways that startled me daily. My eldest began writing essays about justice for school, her words crisp and fearless. My son painted bright murals in his art class, colors splashing across paper like uncontained hope. The youngest carried a notebook filled with small poems about gardens, stars, and laughter. Their creativity, once muted, now bloomed without restraint. Watching them, I felt the years of fear recede like an old tide. These children were not broken. They were warriors of joy, carrying forward the lessons of resilience without letting bitterness soil their hearts. Sometimes I wondered if they would ever know the full extent of what they had survived. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe it was enough that they had survived, and more than that, thrived. Their futures stretched before them like open roads, roads I had once feared they would never walk. In the quiet of evening, when the garden glowed in the last light and the children slept, I often sat with Lydia on the porch. We spoke of ordinary things, bills, recipes, schedules, but beneath it all lay an unspoken gratitude that we had weathered the storm together. She had been my anchor, my fiercest ally, and my reminder that love could outlast cruelty. One night I turned to her and said, "We've built something stronger than revenge, haven't we?" She squeezed my hand, her smile steady. "Yes," she said. "We've built a life." It struck me then how easily vengeance could consume, and how carefully we had redirected its flame into warmth instead of destruction. Marlene had tried to break us, but in the end, she had forged us into something unshakable. That was the truest revenge of all. Not her downfall, but our survival. The community, too, had changed. The pastors' group had grown into a coalition that held regular workshops on family support, and the school launched a program to ensure no child went hungry. At block parties, people looked out for one another, sharing resources and stories. Our ordeal had cracked something open, and light had poured through. Sometimes people approached me with gratitude, saying my courage had inspired them. I accepted their words, but deep down I knew courage had been born from desperation, from the refusal to let my children suffer quietly. Yet if my desperation could spark hope in others, then maybe it was worth every sleepless night. The town would never be perfect, but it was awake, and awake towns make fewer mistakes. I smiled at the thought that Marlene, in trying to silence me, had inadvertently awakened an entire community. As I sit now telling you this story, I realize that every chapter of pain led to a chapter of growth. They starved my children at family dinners, but now my children feast on laughter, love, and possibility. They tried to break me with silence, but I found my voice. They thought cruelty would define us, but it became the forge that shaped us. To anyone listening, I want you to remember this. Speak your truth, protect those you love, and never underestimate the power of a voice raised in the dark. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep in your chest, I ask you to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Because every story told is another light turned on in the dark, and together we can make sure no one eats in silence again.